It's a reaction to yesterday's government commissioned report, which found that the UK is not institutionally racist. That was the conclusion of the report, at least. This is the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, set up in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. The report says we no longer see a Britain where the system is deliberately rigged against ethnic minorities. Huge debate, huge rows about this, really. And we're interested in how this tallies with your own experience in the UK. Do get in touch on 85058. Kehinde Andrews is a professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University. And we also have Calvin Robinson, political advisor, commentator and educationalist. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Morning.
Kehinde, the UK is not institutionally racist. How did you respond to that when you heard it?
To be honest, I left. The report is so bad, its conclusions so badly drawn. It would be funny unless the joke was on people who are already racially disadvantaged. Sorry, this was never a genuine attempt to actually understand the issues of racism. But there is lots of data and lots of evidence and lots of almost settled consensus. It's so obvious. This was actually an attempt for the government to basically get together some institutional racism deniers so they could pretend the problem doesn't exist.
Can I just ask, before we get Calvin's response, how you define institutional racism? Is it possible, for example, to say that the country as a whole is not institutionally racist, but there are institutions within it that display structural racism?
No, institutional racism is about society. If you go back to Carmichael and Hamilton, where the first people to use institutional racism, they make it very clear that, yes, we are talking about police, the schools, the institutions, but it's actually about the society. And so if you think about the stats that Black people are more likely to die from COVID-19, you can't explain that by one thing. It's about housing, it's about employment, it's about class, it's about lots of things. But it generally is the fact that we have, if you look at all the evidence will tell you, that there is a clear racial and ethnic penalty that when we go through all the institutions of society. And again, the data there is abundantly 100% clear. And only a liar or a fool would deny it.
Well, I want to step out of this discussion, really, and allow Calvin to respond and for the two of you to talk through some of the key findings. So, Calvin, do you want to step in here?
Sure, absolutely. Because I think this report is very helpful because instead of casting aspersions and yelling institutionalized racism, and like Professor Andre said, our society is racist, that helps no one. What it actually does is it looks down to the core issues and tries to find out what's going on here. So it actually proves that there are lots of racial disparities in this country. There's lots of things that need addressing, but it doesn't just assume that they're racist just because there are racial disparities. So we know there are issues regarding geography and class in this country, where you live and what class you're in, how much money you have. There are lots of different health issues, lots of different cultural issues, religious issues. Family structure plays a large part to play in people's lives. So all of this adds up to a bigger picture. It's more complicated than just saying, yeah, our society is racist, because it isn't. This is one of the most diverse, inclusive, tolerant nations in the world. It's a fantastic place to live. And, Professor Andrews mentioned COVID, kind of implying that COVID-19 is somehow racist or that people are affected differently because of their race. And when we look at this data, this evidence, what we see is there are behavioral issues, there are cultural issues, there's genetic issues, and there's, societal issues such as more people from ethnic minorities tend to live in multi-generational households than white British families, and that's going to have a part to play in spreading of COVID. So there are things that we need to address and work on, but if we just stand on the street corner yelling our society is racist, that helps no one. And what this report does is it looks deep down into the data and collates all the evidence and says, how can we move forward? We've made a lot of progress, but how can we move forward in fixing the disparities that still remain in our society?
I'm sorry, that is utterly ridiculous. The idea that I, as a professor, as somebody who actually has spent years working on these issues, and there are many of us who spent years looking at the data, working on this data, understand the complexities, and every single complexity you talked about cannot be understood outside of race. The idea that we just stand there shouting institutional racism is frankly disrespectful and ludicrous. It's actually the other side of this debate, which comes on and says, well, look, no, because I don't feel racism, there's no racism. Actually, no, this is complicated.
No one said there's no racism.
But the evidence, I'm sorry, the evidence is very clear, and this is part of the problem we have this, where you equate a professor who spends years, writes books, does this for a living, is the actually credible voice on this with a blogger and a commentator. I'm sorry, this is not credible. And the people who wrote this report were not credible either. And there are many people in this country who are credible. And if you had gone to them and asked them what the issues are, then we'd have got a much better response. But that was not the point. It's about propaganda to pretend this doesn't exist. And Calvin Robinson's part of that movement, unfortunately.
So I think there are a lot of distinguished people on this commission, and to say they're not credible just because they don't agree with you is actually offensive to all of the people.
That's not a bad thing. Sorry, they're not credible because they're not credible. I'm sorry. I'm sorry,
Well,
there are many experts on race and racism in this country. None of them were on the panel. They were picked purposely. Tony Sewell, for example, I've had a number of run-ins with him. He has his opinion. He's been wrong for a long time. The consensus in the academic community is that he's wrong. And there are much more credible people that could have been asked. He was asked because he was going to deny institutional racism, and he denied institutional racism. This is propaganda. It is not a serious attempt. The way they use the evidence is it's actually laughable. So to pretend this does not prove anything, it just proves the government is not serious about the issue of racism. That is all.
Okay, Professor Andrews, let's stop this anti-government rhetoric for a minute. Let's talk about this report, and let's talk about it sensibly. There are a lot of recommendations in this report that I think would help racial disparities in this country. Are you saying that this report should be disregarded because it doesn't align with your views, or do you agree that this report has lots of recommendations that would help race relations in this country?
No, I'm saying that this report should be rejected because it is a bad report. It doesn't do what it is. It misuses data. It misrepresents the situation. It actually has some really deeply racist stereotypes about you've brought some of those up today about culture, about the impact of genetics. It's just bad scholarship. If this was submitted as a first year, I'd just throw it out. I don't agree with it. Fair enough. But it's actually just bad, and that's the way it should be rejected. In terms of his recommendations, there's nothing in his recommendations that have not been recommended before. I mean, honestly, there's nothing new in there. Please do not take this report as some genuine attempt to deal with these issues.
One thing I'm interested to hear from both of you on this is the whole dynamic of class and geography and how that can, according to this report, potentially be masked if we solely focus on race and therefore those issues not addressed. How do you interpret that? Maybe I can hear from you, Calvin, first of all.
Yeah, thank you. So I see this quite clearly as an educationalist myself. So every day in school, and Professor Andrews will have heard me say this before, but every day in school, we see the fact that Black African kids are excelling throughout primary school and throughout secondary school. They're exceeding really well. They're twice as likely to go to university than white British kids, and white British kids are at the bottom of the league table, along with Black Caribbean kids. So when people tell me that the education system in this country is institutionally racist, I say, how is that possible when Black African kids are doing really, really well, Black Caribbean kids are doing less well? Okay, so there's a clear disparity there between those two Black communities. So we can't lump all Black people together as one, first of all. But secondly, if it's institutionally racist, surely it's racist towards white people then who are at the bottom and Black Caribbean people. How can you separate the two?
Well, a final thought from Kehinde, if we can.
Because that's, again, totally ridiculous. When you look at these issues of race, you have to look through them class. And actually, the reason you've had historically differences between Black African and Black Caribbean is because of class. Black African families have tended to migrate with more money as students. Black Caribbean families, like myself's family, tended to come with less money, and it's actually a class issue.
Kehinde
That doesn't mean
and
it's not
Calvin,
about race.
thank you so much to both of you for talking to us this morning. We appreciate it.